Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. In this video, I'm just going to talk briefly about my other church experiences. A few weeks ago, I did a video talking about growing up in the Pentecostal church, which is the denomination that I spent the most time in. However, when I was growing up, there were a few years where I attended non-Pentecostal churches. And then I've also just attended a bunch of other churches over the years, one or two times, usually with family or friends or something like that. And I wanted to mention those as well. Okay, so as I already mentioned in my Pentecostal video, I grew up in the Pentecostal church and I attended these churches from birth until about 18 years old. But in that time period, there was about 5 years where I attended different churches that were non-Pentecostal. Around the age of 10 years old, my parents decided to leave the Pentecostal church that we were all attending as a family. And so for a couple years, we attended a church called Grace Bible Church. I really don't remember what denomination it was. I looked it up, but I wasn't able to figure it out. There are a couple denominations that really focus on the theme of grace, but I'm not really sure what specific denomination that church was part of. But I remember hearing my parents and other adults in the church talk, and the theme of grace was a really big one in the church. The idea of grace being that people are sinners and that Jesus Christ paid for our sins purely out of grace, not because we deserved it, but as an act of love and mercy. And so this greater theme of grace was really big in this church. But I attended this church from about ages 10 to 12, and so I was still quite young and I hadn't really formed my own beliefs that strongly. But my time at this church was overwhelmingly positive. I was part of the kids group, and there was an excellent kids leader named Darlene Rempel. I'm going to use her real name in case she's out there. I haven't seen her since I was a kid, but she's really a wonderful lady. I also remember this specific church had a climbing wall in the back. So this church had been formed out of an old warehouse. It was in sort of this light industrial area of the city, like a lot of churches are. And so this church had taken over an old warehouse, and in the back loading dock area with high ceilings, they had this climbing wall. I think it was mostly for the older teenagers, but us younger kids couldn't help and sort of partially climb the wall as much as we were able to. So that was a lot of fun. But I really look back on my time in these churches with fondness, and this Grace Bible Church really provided an excellent community for its congregation. And I remember I formed many temporary friendships. We went to many events with different members of the church, and we often attended another summer camp, which was separate from the Pentecostal summer camp I grew up attending. And in this other camp, they had archery and zip lines and horseback riding, and that was a lot of fun. But in terms of my personal theology, I was very young, and although I said I believed in God, and I sort of did, and I prayed a little bit too, I really didn't have a fully formed theology in my mind. My frontal lobe hadn't developed yet, and I was still very young. But my memories of this church were really good. And then after a couple years of attending this church, my parents split up, and so we no longer attended this church together. And then shortly after that, I started attending another church in Edmonton with my brother, and this was Knox Metropolitan United Church, part of the United Churches of Canada. And me and my brother attended the youth group at this church for about 3 years. Now I'm just going to briefly mention what the United Church is. The United Church of Canada is a mainline Protestant denomination, and it's the second largest Canadian Christian denomination after the Catholic Church. And basically mainline Protestant denominations are more theologically liberal and progressive than more conservative evangelical, fundamentalist, charismatic, and Pentecostal denominations. The United Church was founded in 1925 as a merger of 4 different Protestant denominations with a total combined membership of about 600,000 members. And these 4 different groups were the Methodist Church, the Congregational Union of Ontario and Quebec, about 2/3 of the congregations of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and then the Association of Local Union Churches, which was a movement predominantly in the Prairie provinces. And so these 4 different groups combined to become the United Church of Canada. Membership in the United Church peaked at about 1.1 million in 1964, and it has declined ever since. Like I mentioned, the United Church is definitely a lot more progressive than the Pentecostal Church. Interfaith marriages are recognized. There are no gender, sexual orientation, or marital status restrictions on ministers, and so you'll often find female or queer ministers. And of course, over time, the United Church has been criticized for being too liberal and not having strict enough doctrinal orthodoxy. Like many other churches, the United Church takes part in the ceremony and ritual of communion, and they also take part in baptism, which is actually the first step in becoming a member of the United Church, very similar to other churches. But even though the United Church is seen as very liberal and progressive now, they were very involved in the residential school system in Canada, something that is often blamed entirely on the Catholic Church. But when you go back, the United Church was also very involved in the residential school system, and that's something that they really have to reconcile with. And so me and my brother attended a United Church youth group, like I mentioned, this was at the Knox Metropolitan United Church in Edmonton. I don't know if the church organization still exists, but that church itself has been demolished, and it's a real shame. I don't know, it almost had this Middle Eastern vibe. It didn't have the traditional peaked steeple, but it had this large octagon-shaped window that was quite distinct and just not what you'd typically find in other churches. And it's a real shame this building was demolished. I remember as I was attending this church, one of my favorite things to do was simply to explore the church. Besides the main auditorium, it had all these meeting rooms and offices and hallways and secret passages, or so we thought. And so it was just a lot of fun to explore this church. That's something I've liked to do since I was a kid. And my time at this church was fairly positive as well. I was part of a youth group. We would attend meetings on Friday nights, I think. We would do many social events throughout the week. And often as a youth group, we would just attend the regular Sunday morning services as well. And compared to my time in the Pentecostal church, the United Church is a lot more relaxed and less intense. In Pentecostal church services, quite often you'll have people speaking in tongues, something called glossolalia. People will often prophesy over one another and attempt to exorcise them of demons. And another thing that's very common in Pentecostal services is that the pastor or church leadership at the end of the service usually will make an altar call where they will encourage people to come up to the front to be converted, to allow Jesus Christ as their personal savior so that their souls will be saved and that they can enter heaven and avoid hell. And this is a big part of Pentecostal church services, but that didn't really happen in the United Church. There wasn't ever really a formal call for conversion at the end of the services. And in general, the United Church is just a lot less evangelical than the Pentecostal church. Evangelism is really a big part of the Pentecostal church. There's this culture of sort of promoting your religion and trying to win souls for the Lord. Whereas in the United Church, that's just not really part of the general spirit of how they do things. They really consider themselves non-evangelical. They don't really make an attempt to convert other people to the United Church or to Christianity in general. And I'm not saying evangelism is bad necessarily. I'm very uncomfortable with it, but I totally understand that if you feel like you found something that really benefits your life, you might want to help other people get to the same place you are. But often it's not done out of pure altruism, and it's a very problematic thing in my opinion. And I don't really want to get into that too much right now. I'll just say that the United Church, at least in my experience, is far less evangelical than the Pentecostal church. And as is common in most churches, my time with the United Church involved a lot of community outreach and charity. Most churches volunteer in the community to some degree, whether that's handing out gifts at Christmas, working in soup kitchens, trying to do different things to help local homeless populations, or donating to charities abroad. Most churches do something like this, and that was also a big part of my time at the United Church. And that consistent giving back is something that I think churches in general do very well. United Church services are also fairly traditional, particularly in the music. Like one thing you'll find at Pentecostal churches is that the music portion is painfully modern. And what I mean by that is sometimes it's just very cringy. I find that Pentecostal churches make a strong attempt to produce modern sounding music to appeal to young people. And often you'll have these younger pastors that dress in these wild, obnoxious outfits, and they sort of have this cool guy persona. And I find it all to be very annoying and cringy.
You spin me right round, Jesus, right round, like a record, Jesus, little bit louder.
Whereas I did appreciate the more traditional music of the United Church, although many people will disagree with me on this. I also definitely did find that the United Church was more theologically liberal and progressive. I remember a couple Sunday services where they would open up the service to the youth group who were allowed to present their questions on what they believe, including addressing some of their doubts and concerns over the generally accepted theology of the church. And I remember that was really interesting. And I definitely think that more conservative denominations like the Pentecostal church could definitely be more open to questioning and doubting. I also think that churches could be a lot more open to people that are non-believers, because churches provide an excellent source of community for people. And I don't necessarily think it's necessary for someone to believe everything in the generally accepted doctrine to be part of the church. But I definitely think one of the positive things about the United Church is that they're more theologically open to questioning and doubting, as well as being more accepting of alternate lifestyles. And then after a couple years of attending this youth group, me and my siblings started attending another Pentecostal church that was in the same area. I sort of forget, but I think we knew a couple people at this other Pentecostal church, and we had grown up in the Pentecostal church, so it seemed like a good fit. And I've already talked about my time at this other Pentecostal church in my other video. And then I just wanted to briefly mention a few of the other churches I attended as well. Like I mentioned, when I was about 10 years old, my parents decided to leave the Pentecostal church, and then we eventually started going to this other one called Grace Bible Church. Prior to that, we actually checked out a couple other churches as well. I remember as a family for a couple Sundays, we attended this mostly black church in Edmonton. I don't really know why we went there. We felt welcome and it was a lot of fun. I remember, just as you might expect, stereotypically, it was very animated. There was a lot of soul, particularly in the singing of hymns, and I found that experience to be interesting, but we only attended a couple services. I also remember a couple times when my parents would take us to sort of community outreach churches, including one on a very rough area of 118th Avenue in Edmonton. I think it was held at the Community League, and at the time my parents had a bunch of friends that were involved in community outreach, in evangelizing to people in some of the rough areas of Edmonton and the world. And I just remember a couple times attending these street outreach churches, and I just have to share one thing that really stuck with me. I remember I was like 11 years old attending one of these street churches, and I remember one guy that was a little bit rough stood up to give his testimony, which is definitely a good thing. It sounded like this guy had had a pretty rough life and he was doing a lot better now. But in his testimony, he talked about the most graphic things that were pretty wild for an 11-year-old to hear. And there were much younger kids than me in the congregation at this time. It was pretty wild. But he was talking about injecting drugs all over his body, making love to animals, committing all sorts of crimes. And I just remember hearing this wild testimony. It was a bit jarring to hear. But honestly, if you attend church for a while, you're going to hear some pretty wild testimonies. And then I've also attended Catholic Mass a couple times, just going with Catholic friends. This was when I was a bit younger, and I felt a combination of two things. I definitely found these services to be kind of boring, but I also found them interesting. One thing I really like about Catholic churches in particular is the beauty. I find that Catholic churches are a lot more beautiful on the outside and the inside. And especially over time, I really like the traditionalism of the Catholic Church. Like I mentioned, I find it really cringy how a lot of Protestant denominations try so hard to be young, hip, and modern. And what I like about Catholic churches is that they don't really do that. They're very firm in their traditions, and I find that their services and even just the interior of Catholic churches are very beautiful and very awe-inspiring to take in. I also feel the same way about the Christian Orthodox Church. Some of my family are very heavily involved in the Orthodox Church, and I find the same sense of awe and beauty in the Orthodox Church. These church interiors are really beautiful to look at. They have all sorts of icons and artwork and carvings and candles. And when I've attended this church, during the service, the priest will walk around swinging a ball of incense. And as the incense fills the air, it just provides another source of sensory stimulation. And the Orthodox church that I attended also had a very beautiful choir. Honestly, I much prefer an Orthodox or Catholic church choir to a modern Protestant church band with smoke machines and electric guitars. If I'm going to listen to modern music, I'm going to listen to good modern music. I sometimes wish the church would stick with their traditions because that's what they do best. I actually think there's a growing trend where people are interested in the traditional churches over the modern churches. And that's just my opinion. And that's pretty much it for my other church experiences. I think I'm going to wrap up this video now because I did want to do a little video talking about my non-Pentecostal church experiences. And I think I've said everything I want to say. And honestly, as I'm thinking back on what I just recorded, I don't think I said anything really original or insightful. But I just wanted to talk about my non-Pentecostal church experiences. And I think I've done that. I hope you found that somewhat interesting and informative. And if you'd like to watch more of my content in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload about one new video per week. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.